Good morning. It's my pleasure to be here and provide the most anticipated presentation of the conference, an update to the Mining Act review. Digging into legislation is always quite interesting. Nonetheless, this is one of several key pieces of legislation that forms our provincial regulatory framework for mining projects. Implementation of this piece of legislation falls to my group, the Mineral Development Division. And actually, if we could advance to the next slide, or
it's right here. Sorry about that.
Perfect. And just back one, and then all right. There we go. Thank you. I did an extra couple of minutes for me to figure this out, so we're still good. So speaking of my group, I just wanted to pause for a moment and acknowledge the great people that I work with. The Engineering Analysis Group generally administers the Mining Act day-to-day, but I can attest to the fact that the work of the Mineral Industry Analysis Group and Mineral Incentive Program are great resources to industry. I just want to thank all the team in the division, and I'm always impressed by your commitment to this important work. You are to be commended. So what I want to do here today is to discuss why this review is necessary, provide an update on the work completed, and insight into some of the issues that have been identified. However, what I want to accomplish through this is to facilitate engagement to help shape and inform possible future changes. This means answering questions such as, is the status quo acceptable? Or, if changes are required, what do these need to look like? So why was a review of the Mining Act initiated? Well, the Act came into force in 1999, and in December of this year it will reach its 25th birthday. That's a long time to go without changing. This piece of legislation affects the development, operations, and closure of mining projects in the province. It also shares issues that are impacted by other pieces of legislation that may or may not have changed. While the Act has stayed constant, which is good for regulatory stability, the social, technological, environmental, and economic conditions affecting mining have continued to evolve. These factors create new expectations and need to consider better practices and regulatory processes, and therefore a need to review the Act. The regulatory framework of any jurisdiction fills many roles, not least of which is ensuring responsible development, and this will always be the intent. Our regulatory process needs to be effective. This will enable stakeholders and communities to see that sufficient controls are in place, and this is necessary for projects to raise the social capital necessary to proceed. A review of this legislation is aligned with the provincial vision statement to be a globally competitive jurisdiction and make sure that our regulatory process is clear, transparent, and efficient. Considering these factors, combined with the importance of mineral development to the province, as has already been discussed here this morning, government committed to undertake a review of both the Mineral Act and the Mining Act. The Mineral Act is administered by the Mineral Lands Division and regulates mineral tenure and exploration. Kevin Shepherd is the director, and I see him sitting there. If he can give everyone a wave, you'll know who to track down after. So in 2022, a review of both acts was initiated, including industry and stakeholder engagement. This culminated in the release of a What We Heard document in February 2023. For the Mining Act, which is the topic of this talk, it focuses on both the development and closure of mining operations. We have continued to engage with stakeholders and complete analysis such as detailed jurisdictional scans, and this work has helped to identify potential areas of change and possible approaches to modifications. So I'm happy to share some of These areas where opportunities to improve clarity, increase efficiency, and create transparency may exist. The first issue relates to regulatory clarity and involves prudent resource management. This is a foundational requirement of the Mining Act, and it is to ensure maximum development is realized from provincial non-renewable resources. This includes both the technical viability of the mode of development and the economic viability of the proposed operation. These two lenses are understood and demonstrated through requirements including the submission of a development plan and rehabilitation and closure plan. But a project may have an acceptable mode of development, possess an ore reserve statement that tests economic viability, as well as information on costing and capital expenditures. However, it still may not demonstrate prudent resource management, and this implies a lack of clarity. So a question that is considered as part of prudent resource management is, for a mining project, what is the potential impact on mineral resources outside of those identified for extraction? For instance, environmental assessment considers the full scope of a project. A similar lens is required to achieve prudent resource management. What are some of the changes that could be considered to provide clarity here? Some of these include, first, should prudent resource management be defined within the legislation? Should specific requirements be introduced, such as aligning with other jurisdictions and require a feasibility study or other defined economic studies? We heard during our consultations that companies, both public and private, need to be held to the same standard. This requirement to include a mineral reserve statement that adheres to CIM or equivalent definition standards can be brought forward into the regulations or the Act. The next issue relates to duplication, red tape reduction, and regulatory efficiency. The technical assessment of a mining project under the Mining Act is satisfied through review and approval of two separate documents. The development plan details the mode of development and operations, and the rehabilitation and closure plan that details measures from progressive to final rehabilitation. This also informs financial assurance requirements. These are standalone documents, and this creates some advantages and disadvantages. On the positive side, it does allow for an update to one document should there be a significant alteration that falls under only one plan. However, on the negative side, it creates duplication in regulatory filings. The highlights on the slide here demonstrates the overlap. This creates additional work for companies to ensure documents align. It requires two separate approvals and potentially lengthens review time. During our scan, it was noted that development and closure planning were not separate documents in other jurisdictions, with aspects of both falling under the same filing. So a potential modification here could include combining the development plan and the rehabilitation and closure plan into one regulatory filing. This would eliminate duplication. This would also align the requirements to update both development and closure planning to the same period, further simplifying both filing and review. As an option to provide additional clarity, including the 5-year update requirement under the Act or regulations versus in guidance documents could also be considered. So in mining, the scope and scale of projects are unique to every deposit, and an assessment of the technical aspects of operations and closure must reflect the necessary level of diligence. Our current regulatory framework is constructed to consider layers of complication that may exist, such as those related to operations, processing, tailings management, acid rock drainage, and so on. For projects without complications, there are fewer issues that require diligence to satisfy the regulatory requirements. For example, if a project does not require a tailings management facility, this will eliminate the requirement for associated design and long-term dam monitoring. This reduces the regulatory burden. Currently under the Mining Act, I want to mention that certain small-scale operations have the potential to be exempted from all requirements. This was initially created to exempt quarries that had limited disturbance and few layers of complication. A summary of the parameters defining a small-scale project are presented here on the slide. However, meeting these parameters, again, does not mean that a project will be exempted. Again, this implies an issue of clarity. This exemption has almost been entirely used or applied to certain qualifying quarries. However, proposed legislation, the Quarry Resources Act, may eliminate Mining Act regulatory involvement. So should this occur, this exemption may no longer be required. So to improve clarity as it relates to the small-scale exemption, some changes that could be considered here include replace the exemption with a small-scale designation and create a specific regulatory requirement that reflects the appropriate level of oversight. The proposed Quarry Resources Act has actually taken this approach for quarries. Alternatively, the small-scale exemption could be removed, and we could rely on the existing regulatory framework to deliver the appropriate level of diligence based on the level of complexity associated with the site. During stakeholder engagement and conversations with operators and developers, a path to return a former mine site to the province through relinquishment is desired. The Mining Act does not establish the parameters around relinquishment, even though it requires planning for rehabilitation and closure. It also establishes the requirements for the lessee to execute the work when the time comes and provide financial assurance as part of rehabilitation closure acceptance. However, Section 10(9) of the Act states when the minister accepts the surrender of a lease, financial assurance from the lessee is no longer required. This has at times been interpreted by the industry as once rehabilitation and closure work is complete, then relinquishment would occur. Unknown liabilities, there are issues that complicate relinquishment, and these include unknown liabilities that can result in ongoing costs associated with unidentified contamination, unanticipated repairs, or changing best practices relating to the environment, site, or infrastructure management. There are tools, however, that are helping to address some of these issues. For example, the provincial guidance document for the management of impacted sites and the Canadian Dam Association Dam Safety Guidelines can help mitigate some of these liabilities. But it's important for the Act to provide regulatory clarity with respect to relinquishment, so to adequately inform project planning. So what are some of the options here? Well, the inclusion of a statement that clearly identifies the criteria for relinquishment can be included as part of our regulatory framework. This can be prescriptive and include reference to impacted sites management and CDA safety guidelines, or establish broader targets such as relinquishment to the province can occur for sites that possess no liabilities. As well, should surface rights or some means of tenure be created to facilitate the partial relinquishment of a closed site for those areas without liability. These are all options for consideration and hopefully to spur further conversation. So finally, the environment in which mining and mineral development operates is evolving. From a technical perspective, there are better practices and more fulsome consideration of risks. It's safe to say that the diligence required today to design and construct a mine is far greater than had existed back when many of our orphan and abandoned mines were created. This increased level of design, planning for closure, and regulatory oversight is a trend globally, but despite this, it's becoming increasingly difficult in other jurisdictions for many mining projects to generate the social acceptance or generate the social capital necessary for sustainability. As part of the Mining Act review, consideration has been given to identify opportunities to increase regulatory transparency. One option that could be considered would be the proactive disclosure of approvals and permitting status under the Mining Act. Another option, would be to consider proactive disclosure of sections of, or alternatively full, rehabilitation closure plans, or even development plans submitted under the Act. Disclosure here could align with the Provincial Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act. The benefit of proactive disclosure is enabling communities and stakeholders to have access to information that can inform decisions without needing to use an ATIP request. This would increase the level of regulatory transparency and possibly help fill a void that, when not filled with correct information, is often filled with rumors and guesses. As I mentioned, this presentation is meant to initiate a conversation and to identify and inform potential changes to the Mining Act. Rest assured that prior to any future changes, further engagement will occur. So I would be happy to discuss during the conference or after anything that you may have heard during this presentation, or maybe even more importantly, things that you didn't hear during this presentation. With that, thank you once again, and please enjoy the rest of your conference.